6:50 a.m. and Marshall was going to be late for work. Not the first time lately, to be honest, but Bundu seemed to be cutting him some slack. Even so, Marshall was stretching a point by now, but wasn't sure he cared that much. He'd showered in one of the communal bathrooms, put on a clean shirt and pulled on his regulation suit trousers as he tried to simultaneously take a slurp from the coffee he'd hurriedly made himself. He finally put the cup down to limit the risk of mishaps, picking it up again after fastening his belt. He downed the rest of the lukewarm liquid in one and grabbed his jacket from the bed before heading out for the day. He exited the building via the back entrance, which differed from what people considered to be the front, only in that it opened into a turning circle rather than out towards the main car park. As he opened the door, he came upon the side of one of the hospital transport vans, parked closer than was strictly necessary to the porch. The engine was off, and a man was leaning against it, smoking a cigarette. "Nobby," greeted Marshall. "Early start, mate?" he asked. "Student run," said Nobby, a man of few superfluous words. "Righto, many to go?" Nobby took a pull on his cigarette and inhaled loudly, then jerked a thumb towards the van, which Marshall now saw was packed with people and luggage. "Waiting for the last one." "Well, you can't hold me up like this. I'm late for work. Good talk, by the way," said Marshall as he walked away. Nobby said nothing. Paul Clark, Nobby to his friends, co-workers, family, well, everyone really, was another fixture of the hospital. Some would say an institution in and of himself. He was likely only in his late 40s, but with the demeanour of a man who'd seen more than his fair share over the last 100 years or so. Everyone seemed to like him, though, probably because he was punctual, efficient, and just got on with things. Sort of no harm to anyone. He had family at the hospital. His son had just started working as an auxiliary on the same elderly ward worked by Elaine and Nicola, and his wife, partner, whatever she was, Marshall didn't actually know, worked in the main kitchen as a cook, one of around 30 people needed to cater for the 1,500 or so patients. Marshall climbed the stairway to the ward door around 7 o'clock and used his passkey to unlock the big old Gibbons of Wolverhampton lock, which led him into an antechamber serving as a security airlock to prevent patients from making a run for it. Not that if they did get out, they stood much chance of making it to civilization, given the distance involved. He slammed the door behind him, and the echoes took a second to subside, whilst he opened the inside door with the same key. He replaced the small bunch on the hook on his belt and stepped in, closing the door with his back to it. Entering the large dining area through an open doorway to his right, he made his way diagonally to the observation station in the far corner. The morning sun streamed through an enormous bay window to his left, and he blinked at its brightness. The door to the station was open, and he went through it, and a second door at its rear, into the ward office where the team for that morning was gathering for shift handover. "Good afternoon, Mr. Brent." The Franco-tinged accent always struck Marshall as odd coming from such an Asian-looking face. "Bundu," replied Marshall. "I'm here until after 9 tonight. Surely that counts for something." More of a statement than a question. "Not that I'm not grateful for your picking up so much overtime, but rumour has it you have nowhere else to be at the moment anyway." Marshall had asked for that. "Have a seat. We're just about done here." Sit he did, without further interjection. Handover finished, Bundu said, "I want a word with you before you go upstairs, Marshall," in a tone which brooked no argument. Marshall had just stood up, but sat down abruptly. "I know what you're going to say, Bundu, and it won't happen again, honestly." "Yeah, that's right. But it's not my only concern, boy." Patronising at best. "There's new staff here. Not to mention a batch of new students starting next week. This is not the example I want for them. You're a good nurse, and you're better than this shambles you're giving me at the moment. Well, it's not a democracy, boy. Well, nothing. Get your act together, or you can go and work with the subnormals or something. I don't need it here, understood? Marshall balked at the term, which even in 1986 seemed disrespectful to those with learning disabilities. Mind you, the official moniker of mentally handicapped was only marginally better. I get it, Bundu, sorry. Right. Push off and get some work done, tosser. With that, he looked down at his desk to signify the audience was over. Marshall trudged despondently to the second floor, which held the patient's bedroom, a long communal dormitory with beds along the right-hand wall below a line of high windows, each bed with its own pull-around curtain for what passed as privacy back then. As he entered, he greeted the night staff, some of whom traditionally stayed upstairs until relieved. He found Kenneth, a skinny Rastafarian kid who joined the team about 2 months ago from one of the long-stay wards, standing in the doorway to the right office. The youngster's dreadlocks looked out of sorts with the long white coat he wore as his uniform. You still wearing that doctor disguise, Kenneth? Force of habit, man, said Kenneth. Needed it to keep the shit off me on a Fiat. Wards had numbers, which further served to make it even less like home to those who lived there. Well, you can keep wearing it if you prefer, but I warn you, it's going to get in the way at some point. You'll thank me later. Maybe. We'll see how it goes. Suit yourself. They entered the night office, a misnomer since it contained a desk mostly for the purposes of making tea and coffee throughout the night from a large water boiler and a 2-pint aluminium teapot with Bakelite handles. The rest of the space was taken up with a box trolley for the patient's record system in hanging files and a number of vinyl-covered hospital chairs, some of which had towels draped over them to make them less sweaty to sit on for over 10 hours. Kenneth, Marshall, Bill Sharkey, another staff nurse, and Terry Peck, another nursing assistant, passed the next 40 or so minutes drinking and chewing the fat before deciding it was the allotted time to be getting patients out of bed for the day. They moved along the bedroom, waking the men in less than ceremonious fashion, sometimes just with a couple of words, sometimes by threatening to, or actually, tipping beds up to an uncomfortable angle for the patient. Not exactly humane, but they'd learned from their predecessors like most, and could see nothing wrong with it. They herded patients to and from the communal bathroom, offering impolite words of encouragement where the progress was slow, and stationed themselves in the habitual places for which they knew their view of proceedings was best and safest. Curtains were drawn for patients to dress, but their dignity was definitely not a prime concern. If they were bothered by this, they said nothing, since it would likely be seen as being awkward or difficult. Being unhappy with the arrangements was not a normal response if you were a patient at Her Majesty's pleasure. Most of these men had either been on other wards for years and acted up to be transferred to the secure ward, or had been brought in from elsewhere, either by the police or from the special hospital. For the latter, their situation had improved, and so they would wear the conditions with relish. Their other commonality was that they were all subject to detention under one or other section of the Mental Health Act of 1983. Marshall walked the length of the dormitory room, checking beds were made and patients were dressing rather than getting distracted with inanities or the like. Cyril Walker, a slight, wiry man, sat on the edge of his bed, hands on his knees. He contemplated his feet whilst blowing each breath out between pursed lips, a sort of repetitive sigh, like he was having trouble with the simple task. About 50 years old, Cyril had been in the system since he was much younger. He normally lived on the ward next door, another of the long-stay wards of which there were many, but he'd decided the television was offensive about 4 days ago and taken it upon himself to put it out of its misery. The result was a stint in the secure ward to contemplate the error of his ways, a tactic which flew in the face of both behavioural science and compassion for people with mental illness, a tactic more about making the lives of both staff and other clients easier. Marshall approached the end of Cyril's bed. "Cyril, you planning to be ready by the time we go downstairs?" "I shit myself." His voice was raspy and dry sounding. "Well, you'd best head for the bathroom then, mate. Do you need a hand?" "You're not human." He pronounced it human and sneered at Marshall, whilst just moving his eyes to look at him. "I saw her go downstairs and I shit myself." He jumped to his feet quickly in what seemed to be an attempt to be intimidating. Marshall instinctively let go of the bedstead where he'd been leaning on his hands, but he quickly realised Cyril was acting for effect. He looked around, mildly embarrassed. "Don't know what you're talking about, Cyril, but you need to get ready. You've got about 10 minutes. You're not looking forward to breakfast?" "She went downstairs, I tell you. She was made to go. The little ginger nursey, and I shit. She won't come back up. You'll see. Dark times, these are dark times." Marshall took a step towards Cyril around the bed, and the older man turned half away. All right, I'm coming," he spat, but Marshall could see he was complying and began to walk away. Cyril just went back to his puffing and finished dressing. It seemed he hadn't actually shit, as he put it. The rest of the process went without notable occurrence, and the patients filed downstairs under the watchful gaze of the 4 staff. Once in the dining room, they all sat at the bolted-down tables in the same seats they'd always occupied. Routine was a large part of the day here, and much like in any other institution. They approached a large serving hatch, one table at a time, to get the fare they were being offered. With few exceptions, this was the way of things. Nursing staff and nursing assistants watched the proceedings whilst conversing amongst themselves, with no attempt to engage the patients, except to offer behaviour advice when something deviated from the routine. Calls of, "Where do you think you're off to?" or "Eat first, piss later," were typical responses to these segues in behaviour, but the dining contingent made little conversation amongst themselves, and few spontaneous attempts to engage the staff. The only real staff-patient intercourse happened over little pots of tablets being dispensed from over a Dutch door in the corner of the room, and, in turn, ferried out to the diners at their seats. Back at the nurses' home, Nobby had a full minibus. Well, not entirely true. All but one of his passengers was on board. There was always one. He rolled and lit another cigarette. Holding it between his thumb and forefinger, he sucked on it, watching the end glow red, and then habitually inhaled loudly through his teeth. He savoured the slight burn in the back of his throat, and mused about how he enjoyed the smoke. Nobby was a man of simple pleasures. He reasoned that the duration of his cigarette would be a respectable length of time to wait before leaving without the lollygagger. Nobody would question his actions. He'd done this several times in the past, and he knew the explanation was valid. There were no manifests for these trips, just numbers, pick-up points, destinations and times. Nobby didn't know their names, and didn't really care. It was just a job. Breakfast over, the patients dispersed to various areas around the lounge, games room, and the now cleared dining area. Some watched television, some paced up and down muttering to themselves or conversing with their hallucinations. Some just stared out of windows, perhaps imagining themselves somewhere else. But the pattern of non-conversation continued for the most part, and they stared and smoked their time away. Marshall emerged from the kitchen area, where he'd been counting cutlery only moments before. It wouldn't do for someone to produce a fork later on with some nefarious intent. "Could I have a light, nurse?" said one of the patients, and Marshall fished in his pocket for a moment before producing a lighter with which he lit the man's cigarette. The cheroot was brown in places, like it'd been dampened and dried out, covered in wrinkles where it had lived in a pocket perhaps overnight. The patient's fingers were blackened and calloused with nicotine layers, and Marshall could smell old smoke despite the man's recent wash. As the man walked away, Marshall stood still with the lighter, now extinguished, still held between his hands. He frowned to himself and stared through the floor in front of him, seemingly to the room downstairs. He recalled what Cyril had said to him and realised something about it was unsettling him. "You sleeping, Marshall?" It was Kenneth. "What?" Marshall looked up, his reverie broken. I was just thinking about something, that's all," he smiled. "You okay, Ken?" The Jamaican grinned back. "We got a transfer to pick up this morning, man. I get to go to the holding cells at Luton Nick. They have a 136 for us to bring over, you know the story." He was referring to Section 136 of the 1983 Mental Health Act. It was a part of the law which gave powers to the police to detain someone suspected of suffering from a mental illness and transport them to a place of safety. Usually, this would amount to a police holding cell until they could be moved to an acute admissions ward somewhere with a locked door. "Any details on what we're getting?" said Marshall. "It's a bit sketchy, to be honest with you. Seems the man was walking around the Arndale shopping centre naked and brandishing a hockey stick." "Ah, a sportsman then." "Wouldn't mind watching the ladies' team," chuckled Kenneth as he started back towards the office. "Hang on, mate." Marshall put up his hand. "Something Cyril said this morning has got me thinking." He proceeded to repeat the events to Kenneth, who listened patiently, and then commented that Cyril was not known for his grasp on reality, but Marshall still felt uneasy despite the of agreement he gave his colleague. Kenneth headed off to his task, and Marshall resolved to go seek out the patient and try to get more sense from him, if any was to be had. He found Cyril easily, since, excluding the toilets, there were only really 3 rooms in use for patients. Less cramped than it sounds, since the smallest of these, the lounge, was some 30 feet square with toughened plastic windows on 3 sides. These had been sympathetically matched to the Victorian panel glass sash windows they'd replaced, 4 feet wide and stretching from 3 feet off the floor to 4 feet from the 5-yard high ceilings above. Despite their appearance, though, they would open no more than 4 inches at the bottom or 10 inches at the top to discourage potential escapees. Fine new PVC engineering, crappy ventilation. Cyril was sitting in an armchair underneath the wall-mounted television, a massive boulder of a thing by today's standards, on what resembled an articulated girder for support. The old boy was casting his gaze around the room at his fellow detainees and commenting at a less than discreet volume on their shortcomings, presumably as observed by Cyril's auditory hallucinations, which were well known to provide a running commentary for his days sometimes, and people had grown used to his rantings. "Him, well, he's not that fat," he half shouted, jutting his chin towards an Indian man pacing along the far wall. No, not the best looking, I grant you." He noticed Marshall approaching then, and without missing a beat, now, "Here comes that pale, gay-looking fella." "Thanks, Cyril. I love you too," Marshall responded. "See, I told you, gay." "Yeah, not gay, Cyril. Whatever. I need to ask you something." Cyril puffed and stared at the floor before striking up conversation with his imaginary companion again. I know. "Oh, you were expecting me to come and see you?" "Who was talking to you, screw?" "Oh, yeah, right. Not a screw, Cyril. You're in hospital. I need to ask you." "That's just geography, screw. What makes you think I'll talk?" "Mr. Walker," began Marshall, figuring that additional civility might be the way to go. "You were telling me about how she went downstairs when we spoke earlier." Cyril's face took on a darkness which further reinforced Marshall's conviction that something was amiss. I don't want to talk about it anymore." His focus dragged away from the voices in his head. His puffing breath became more urgent, quicker. She's gone now, and it's too late. He cast his eyes down like this was a terrible burden for him. Who, Cyril? Who are we talking about? Someone you know? Someone I might know? The learning girl. The ginger learning girl from my ward. Learning girl, the nurse mused. One of the occupational therapy team who teaches you stuff there? You're not listening. The learning girl with the white uniform. It dawned on Marshall that the reference was to a student nurse. What on earth was the patient talking about? What happened to her, you say? The older man looked directly at the nurse. They went downstairs into the dark.